The Beaumont Hotel did not shout its wealth. It breathed it. History seeped from the ancient stone of its facade on a quiet Mayfair street where the city's roar softened to a respectful hum. Inside, the air was a soft weighted blanket of beeswax old leather and the faint clean scent of lilies. A muted hush held the grand ballroom, a sound unique to old money, where laughter was never too loud and crystal glasses met with a gentle considered chime. Liam Adebayo moved through this world like a ghost. His cleaning trolley, its rubber wheels silent on the thick Persian rugs, was his vessel. For 5 years at Sunni, he had learned the art of invisibility. It was a choreography of lowered shoulders, of a gaze fixed respectfully on the floor, 3 feet ahead of an instinct that told him which way a guest would turn before they knew it themselves. His uniform, a crisp, simple black shirt and trousers, was a cloak. His name badge reading Liam was a courtesy no one ever used. A junior event manager, a young woman with a sharp blazer and a sharper accent, swept past him. "Let's keep the corridors clear for the photographers, shall we?" Her tone was not unkind. It was the sound of a fact being stated as immutable as gravity. It was the sound of a world where some people were scenery and others were the view. At the start of his shift, Mr. Abernathy, the hotel manager, had spoken to him in that same politely impenetrable way. "Liam, service lift tonight, please. Best not to disturb the guests on the main staircase." He had used his name, but the effect was the same. A line was drawn as clear and fine as a crack in porcelain. Liam navigated the periphery of the ballroom, his movements economical and precise. He collected an empty champagne flute from a side table, his fingers barely grazing the stem. A gentleman in a tweed jacket smelling of cigars and entitlement held out a set of car keys without looking at him. "The Bentley. Have it brought round in 10. The valet station is at the front entrance," Sir Liam replied, his voice calm and even. "I am maintenance staff." The man gave a flat "ah," and his eyes slid off Liam's face as if it were polished glass offering no purchase. He pocketed the keys and turned away the moment already forgotten. Liam was used to it. Here erasure was a skill. He was the quiet ripple that smoothed itself out, the shadow that hugged the marble columns. Occasionally he would hear a murmur as he passed a phrase not meant for him, but for the space he occupied. Really, must they be everywhere? At the far end of the ballroom, on a low velvet-draped stage, sat a Bosendorfer Imperial Grand. It was a magnificent beast, its polished ebony surface drinking the light from the chandeliers and holding it deep within its lacquer. Liam paused, his rhythm broken for a single heartbeat. A phantom sensation ghosted across his fingertips, the cool, weighted resistance of ivory, the ghost of a C-sharp minor he hadn't allowed himself to play in years. The memory came with the scent of his father's study, a room filled with books and fading sunlight. He forced the thought away. He was here to collect glasses, not to chase ghosts. From the grand entrance, a choreographed wave of arrivals signaled the true beginning of the night. Flashbulbs strobed, creating fleeting stark portraits of artificial smiles. And then, as if the sea itself had parted, Lady Eleanor Vance appeared. She was the 5th generation of her name to command the Beaumont, and she wore the legacy like a beautiful diamond-studded yoke. Her gown, a column of ivory silk, seemed to glow from within. A river of diamonds cascaded down her neck. She moved not like a manager, but like the mistress of a historic estate, her smile a perfectly calibrated instrument that revealed nothing. But Liam, a student of unspoken things, saw the tension. There was a tiny tightness in her jaw, a subtle rigidity in the line of her shoulders. He saw it because his own survival depended on noticing such details. Eleanor glided to the center of the room, every eye following her. Inside her head, a different story was playing. A disastrous hotel expansion in Dubai, a board of trustees filled with hawk-eyed cousins and uncles, the hushed whispers about her modern sensibilities, failing the family's legacy. Tonight at the annual Beaumont Heritage Fund Gala was not about charity. It was about projecting absolute, unshakable control. She could feel the gaze of her uncle Lord Ashworth from across the room, his expression as dry and critical as a balance sheet. She took the microphone. Her voice was like cut glass, flawless, brilliant, and cold. "Welcome. We are gathered tonight not simply to celebrate our heritage, but to secure it." Her speech was elegant, peppered with references to tradition and duty. The applause was a polite, rustling cascade. As Eleanor spoke, Liam continued his silent orbit. He bent to retrieve a fallen napkin near the stage, his reflection a dark fleeting shape in the gleaming base of the Bosendorfer. On one side of that polished surface was Lady Eleanor Vance, the inheritor of a gilded world. On his side was the man who polished its floors. A young woman in a feather-trimmed dress paused as Liam straightened up her body, recoiling almost imperceptibly. "Oh, sorry, could you just move?" She didn't look at him. She looked at the space he was occupying. "Of course, Madam," Liam murmured, stepping back into the shadows. His name, his history, his talent, all of it dissolved into two simple words. Of course. He stopped his trolley by a service door, the one that led to the quiet fluorescent-lit corridors of the staff world. For a moment, he looked back at the ballroom. It was a perfect, hermetically sealed ecosystem of power and grace. And at its heart stood Lady Eleanor Vance, a portrait of aristocratic perfection trapped in the same gilded cage that kept him on the outside looking in. She was fighting to keep her world from cracking, while he was fighting to simply exist within its walls without being crushed. He pushed the trolley through the door, letting it swing shut behind him. The sound of the gala was instantly muffled, replaced by the low hum of the service elevator. The silence was a relief, but it was also an echo of the life he had been forced to lock away. He exhaled slowly, the ghost of a melody fading before it could fully form. In the polished chrome of the elevator door, he saw a man in a black uniform. That was all. Liam re-entered the ballroom, exchanging one form of silence for another. In the service corridors, the silence was functional, punctuated by the metallic clang of service lifts and the squeak of rubber soles. Here in the grand ballroom, the silence was a performance, a carefully woven tapestry of hushed whispers and the clinking of expensive jewelry. The gala was running with the precision of a Swiss watch, each guest playing their part, each smile deployed at the correct moment. Any disruption to this flawless mechanism was not just an error, it was a transgression. He guided his trolley along the edge of the room, his eyes scanning for the small imperfections he was paid to erase. A stray canapé napkin, a forgotten water glass, a smear of lipstick on a wine stem. These were the details that separated the Beaumont from lesser establishments. His colleague Maria had once said that their job was to chase away the evidence of human messiness. Across the room, Lady Eleanor Vance was trapped in a conversation that was as elegant as it was excruciating. Her uncle Lord Ashworth, a man whose face seemed permanently fixed in a state of mild disapproval, stood before her. He held a glass of whiskey, swirling the amber liquid as he spoke. "The Dubai figures are speaking for themselves, Eleanor," he said, his voice a low rumble that didn't carry beyond their immediate circle. "The board values tradition. Audacity is only celebrated when it succeeds." Eleanor's smile remained fixed, a marvel of social engineering. "It was a calculated risk, Uncle. The market is shifting." Perhaps Ashworth conceded, taking a slow sip. "But the family's name is not a stock to be speculated with. It is a legacy. In times of uncertainty, one must project absolute stability. Fortitude." He let the word hang in the air, a quiet indictment. A waiter appeared at Eleanor's elbow with a silver tray. She took a glass of deep red wine, a Chateau Margaux, she noted, absently chosen for its impeccable pedigree. She needed it. The wine felt cool and heavy in her hand, a temporary anchor in a sea of judgment. Her uncle's gaze flickered to her, and she knew he was seeing not his niece, but a liability on a balance sheet. At that same moment, Liam spotted a wine glass left perilously close to the edge of a small table near the stage. A guest had pushed their chair back carelessly, creating a narrow, awkward passage. Liam knew he had to retrieve it. Leaving it there was a risk, a tiny tear in the perfect fabric of the evening. He murmured a soft, "Pardon me," to the backs of a couple engaged in conversation and began to navigate the tight space. He moved with the fluid economy he had perfected, his body angled to take up the least possible room. He reached the table, his fingers closing around the stem of the abandoned glass. And then it happened. The man in the couple he had just passed shifted his weight, stepping backward without looking, his heel catching the wheel of Liam's trolley. The trolley lurched a single fatal inch. Liam, off balance for a fraction of a second, tried to compensate. His elbow brushed against a woman who let out a tiny gasp. To avoid her, he stumbled forward, his hand still holding the glass he'd just collected. Time seemed to warp, stretching into a thick, slow-motion horror. He saw Lady Eleanor Vance turning away from her uncle, her face a mask of strained composure. He saw the glass of Bordeaux in her hand. He saw his own body clumsy and intrusive, moving toward her on an unalterable trajectory. His outstretched hand, the one holding the empty glass, collided with her arm. The clink of glass on glass was sharp, but it was lost in the silent, shocking spectacle that followed. A perfect, graceful arc of deep crimson wine flew from Eleanor's glass. For a breathless second it hung in the air, a liquid ruby against the chandelier's golden light, before landing squarely on the pristine ivory silk of her gown. A splash of deep crimson bloomed across her chest, a shocking, violent flower spreading its petals over the handcrafted fabric. The first thing to register was not a sound, but the absence of it. A sudden, profound vacuum seemed to pull all noise from the room. The gentle murmur of conversation was sliced clean away. The music from the string quartet faltered into silence. It was a silence of pure, unadulterated shock, 100 pairs of eyes swiveling in unison. Phones that had been politely pocketed were slowly raised their lenses like the unblinking eyes of predators. Liam stood frozen, the empty glass still in his hand. He could feel the heat of 100 stares. Eleanor looked down at the stain. It was a dark, wet wound on her perfect facade, the wine soaked into the silk, darkening from crimson to a bruised purple. In that moment, it was not just a dress, it was the Dubai failure. It was her uncle's word fortitude. It was the weight of 5 generations of flawless vances, all of it desecrated by this single unforgivable blot. The control she had maintained with such ferocious effort shattered. She looked up, her eyes finding Liam's. The polite, distant mask was gone. What remained was cold, aristocratic fury. "What in God's name?" she said, her voice not loud but sharp as a shard of ice slicing through the dead silence. "Have you done?" Liam lowered his hand slowly, placing the glass he was holding back on his tray. He opened his hands, a gesture of peace, of surrender. "I am deeply sorry, my lady. It was an accident." But Eleanor did not see an accident. She saw a final public humiliation. She saw her uncle's inevitable triumphant look of, "I told you so." She saw the story that would be whispered in boardrooms and at dinner parties for weeks. The pressure that had been building inside her for months found its release, condensing into a single point of icy rage aimed at the man standing before her. It was not about a dress. It was about an unraveling, and she would be the one to stop it right here, right now, in front of everyone. The entire room held its breath, waiting for the verdict to fall. The words, "I am deeply sorry, my lady," hung in the air for a moment, an offering of peace that was immediately violently rejected. The silence in the ballroom had transformed. It was no longer the silence of shock, it was the silence of a courtroom awaiting a verdict. Eleanor's laugh was not a sound of humor. It was a sharp, brittle thing like ice cracking under pressure. "Sorry," she repeated the word, dripping with disdain. She took a deliberate step back, widening the circle of attention around them, making Liam the undeniable center of a disaster. "You are sorry?" She looked from the dark red stain spreading across her breast to Liam's face, and her expression was one of utter incredulity, as if a piece of furniture had suddenly spoken out of turn. The fatigue of the past months, the sting of her uncle's criticism, the crushing weight of her family's expectations, it all coalesced into a laser point of fury. She needed to deflect, to pivot, to transform this moment of personal humiliation into a demonstration of absolute power. "Do you have any idea what this is?" she asked, her voice carrying across the hushed room. She gestured to the ruined gown. "This is haute couture. Its price would cover your salary for, what? A decade." The question was not meant to be answered. It was a weapon designed to measure the unbridgeable chasm between their worlds. A faint, predatory murmur rippled through the crowd. Someone near the front, a man with a ruddy face and a smug smile, whispered loudly to his companion, "He's done for." Couldn't afford a single threat of it. The security chief, a burly man named Harris, began to move forward, his posture radiating a quiet threat. He was not intervening, merely repositioning himself to stand like a full stop at the end of Eleanor's accusation. Liam's composure held a small, solitary island of calm in a sea of judgment. "I can cover the cost of the cleaning, my lady," he offered, his voice steady, though he knew the words were meaningless. The cost of restoring such a garment, if it were even possible, would be more than he earned in a year. His offer was a gesture of dignity, not finance. This simple, earnest attempt at amends seemed to enrage Eleanor further. It was his refusal to be utterly crushed that was so infuriating. He was supposed to grovel, to dissolve, to disappear. Instead, he stood there meeting her gaze, a man who still believed in reasonable solutions in a room that ran on power. Her eyes swept the ballroom searching for a tool, an instrument to complete his public demolition. And then they landed on the Bosendorfer. It sat on the stage, magnificent and serene, a symbol of everything he was not. It represented culture, refinement, genius, a world utterly inaccessible to a clumsy maintenance man in a cheap uniform. An idea, cruel and brilliant, sparked in her mind. She would not just dismiss him. She would make an example of him. She would turn him into entertainment. "Compensate me," she said, her voice now dangerously smooth. She smiled, but it was a smile that showed teeth. She turned her body slightly, addressing the room, as if letting them in on a private joke. "How could someone like you possibly compensate for this?" She raised a perfectly manicured hand and pointed a single imperious finger toward the stage. "That piano." The room followed her gesture. 100 pairs of eyes looked from the magnificent instrument back to the quiet man in the black uniform. A few confused titters broke the silence. Eleanor's voice rang out clear and commanding, imbued with all the authority of her name. "If you can play that piano, not just tap at the keys, but play it with the skill of a concert professional, then I will grant you any single request you make." She paused, letting the outrageousness of the proposition sink in. Then she delivered the final binding blow. "I swear on the Vance family name." A collective gasp went through the room. This was no longer a simple cruel joke. Staking the family name on a promise was in this circle tantamount to signing a contract in blood. It was a sacred, almost feudal gesture, a public declaration of honor. It was also the ultimate expression of her contempt. She was so certain of his failure, so assured of his lowly station, that she felt no risk in wagering the most valuable thing she owned, her heritage. Lord Ashworth, her uncle, who had been watching with a grim expression, now allowed a flicker of approval to cross his face. This he understood. She had turned a moment of weakness into a theatrical display of aristocratic dominance. Standing at the edge of the room near a service entrance, the head housekeeper, Mrs. Davies, pressed her lips into a thin white line. Her hands, clasped at her waist, tightened until the knuckles were pale. She had seen this kind of casual cruelty before, dressed up as sport. Sir Alistair Finch, the renowned music critic from the Times, adjusted his spectacles. He didn't smile or sneer. He simply observed, his face a mask of detached professional curiosity. He was witnessing a piece of social theater, and he would judge it as dispassionately as he would a performance. Liam felt the world narrow to 2 points of focus: the cold, challenging eyes of Lady Eleanor Vance and the vast, silent expanse of the Bosendorfer piano. It was no longer a beautiful object. It was a gallows and a pulpit, his potential execution and his only possible salvation. The challenge, cold and absolute, hung in the air. It was not an offer. It was a sentence. A beat of stunned silence followed Eleanor's declaration. Then the room erupted not into outrage, but into the excited, carnivorous murmur of a crowd that senses blood. The tension that had held them captive was released in a wave of cruel amusement. Her wager was so absurd, so magnificently condescending, that it absolved them of any need for compassion. It was a game, and the janitor was the designated pawn. "A request, you say?" shouted a man from a table near the front, his face flushed with wine. "He'll ask for a lifetime supply of polish." Laughter, sharp and loud, rippled through the room. It was the easy laughter of people who had never had to worry about the cost of a dry cleaning bill, let alone the weight of a family's honor. Another voice, this one female, and laced with a kind of bored cruelty, added, "Be careful, Eleanor. He might ask for your dress." More laughter. The joke slid neatly into an old, comfortable groove racing class wrapped in a jest to avoid the ugliness of naming it directly. A few token glances were exchanged, eyes smiling over the rims of champagne flutes. The humiliation was now a spectator sport. The security chief, Harris, relaxed his stance. The situation was no longer a security threat. It had been successfully downgraded to entertainment. He took a step back, melting into the periphery, his job now to watch, not to intervene. Liam could have retreated. The script of his life for the past 5 years demanded it. He could have mumbled an apology, lowered his eyes, and slipped away through the nearest service door, becoming a gap for the wave of derision to glide past. Every instinct, honed by years of self-effacement, screamed at him to make himself smaller, to vanish. But tonight, something inside him refused to break. Perhaps it was the public nature of the insult. Perhaps it was the scent of beeswax and lilies that reminded him so viscerally of another life. Or perhaps it was the cool, assessing gaze of Sir Alistair Finch, the one person in the room who seemed to be watching not for sport, but for substance. For the first time in a long time, Liam felt the ghost of the man he used to be, the man who belonged on a stage stir within him. He looked past Eleanor, his eyes fixed on the Bosendorfer. It waited patient and silent. It did not judge. "I don't need your dress, my lady," Liam said. His voice was not loud, but it was clear and steady, cutting cleanly through the lingering chuckles. The room quieted, slightly intrigued by the unexpected response. "And I do not need you to grant me just any request." Eleanor arched a perfect eyebrow, trying to reel the moment back into the realm of a joke she controlled. "Oh, getting specific, are we? Perfect. The night needs a little drama." The man who had offered the first wager called out, emboldened. "I'll put £500 on him, not even knowing how to open the lid. 1,000 says he can't play a single scale without a mistake," another guest chimed in. Money began to appear, crisp, £50 notes pulled from designer wallets and placed onto tables. The clean excitement of the bets allowed them to fuel the spectacle without confronting the fact that they were paying for a man's public humiliation. Liam ignored the flurry of bets. He kept his gaze fixed on Eleanor, forcing her to be the sole recipient of his words, denying the crowd their role as audience. "If I do this," he said, each word chosen with deliberate care, "if I play that piano and meet your standard, I want only one thing." A thin, mocking smile played on Eleanor's lips. "Do tell. We're all waiting." "I want you to keep your word," Liam stated plainly. "I want you to stand here in front of everyone who heard you make this wager and publicly acknowledge that you will honor the name you swore upon. The request itself will come later." The crowd fell silent again, a different kind of quiet this time. He had not asked for money. He had asked for accountability. He had taken her theatrical gesture of aristocratic honor and turned it back on her, demanding that she treat it not as a joke, but as the binding promise she had claimed it to be. He had called her bluff. For a fraction of a second, a flicker of uncertainty crossed Eleanor's face. This was not the groveling she had expected. This was a countermove played with unexpected precision. But the moment passed, buried under a lifetime of practiced confidence. She was Lady Eleanor Vance. He was the janitor. The outcome was preordained. To show even a hint of hesitation now would be a loss. She let out a longer, more theatrical laugh, this time a sound designed to reassure both herself and her audience that she was still in complete control. "Deal?" she said, her voice ringing with finality. "There are plenty of witnesses here." She swept her arm toward the stage, a grand dismissive gesture. "The piano awaits. The entire city is ready to watch you." Liam gave a single slow nod. He turned from her and began to walk toward the stage. The sound of his simple rubber-soled work shoes on the marble floor was barely audible, but each soft step seemed to land with the weight of a drumbeat, drawing the room's center of gravity with him. The security chief, Harris, instinctively moved to walk in parallel with him a few feet away, escorting not a man, but a moving risk. Davies, watching from the shadows, tightened her hold on the crisp napkin she'd been folding and unfolding in her hands. She gave the smallest, almost imperceptible shake of her head. It was a warning, a plea, a lament. Only Liam saw it. Sir Alistair Finch stepped half a pace forward, his hand in his suit pocket. He watched the way a smirk could rewrite a person, how a dare could become a cage. His gaze shifted from Liam's straight back to the silent Bosendorfer, his eyes behind their thick lenses flickering with a sudden sharp anticipation. He was no longer observing social theater. He was waiting for the curtain to rise. "Come on then," someone urged from the crowd, their smile as thin as a blade. "Don't keep us waiting. There are a lot of white keys on that thing." More laughter, loud but cold, followed the tired racist jibe. Eleanor adjusted her gown, the crimson stain a defiant badge. Her gaze touched Liam as he reached the foot of the stage, not as a person, but as a prop, to be assessed a variable in a social equation she was determined to solve in her favor. Deep down, the exhaustion was still there, the urgent emails, the shareholder pressure, the weight of her uncle's disappointment. But she had chosen to let that exhaustion spill into power, and power, without restraint, always finds the lowest surface to pour onto. Liam inhaled the air thick with the scent of perfume and derision. He set his cleaning tray down on the nearest empty table. Then, with deliberate, unhurried movements, he removed his work gloves, folding them neatly and placing them on the tray. It was the same ritual of tidiness he performed at the end of every shift. But tonight it felt different. It was the shedding of a skin, the casting off of the uniform of invisibility. He performed these small actions one last time before stepping into the spotlight that had been created for him. Space opened by 100 pairs of eyes and a dozen cameras, all waiting for him to fall. Liam stepped up onto the low wooden riser. The shift in elevation was only a few inches, but it felt like crossing a national border. Down on the marble floor, he was scenery. Up here, he was the view. He walked toward the Bosendorfer, not with the bravado of a showman, but with the quiet reverence of a man approaching a long-lost friend. He didn't look at the audience. He didn't acknowledge the smirks, the raised phones, or the crisp banknotes lying on the tables. The derisive noise of the room seemed to recede, becoming a distant, irrelevant hum. He reached the piano bench, pulled it out with a soft, scrapeless motion, and sat. He took a moment. He adjusted his distance from the keys, a precise, measured movement. He dropped his shoulders, letting the tension of the last 10 minutes drain from them. He rolled his wrists, a small, private ritual that belonged to a different life. He was not stalling. He was re-inhabiting himself. From the front row, Eleanor watched her arms crossed, a thin, confident smile plastered on her face. She was giving him enough rope to hang himself. Let him have his little ceremony. The fall would be all the more satisfying. Liam lifted his hands and let them hover over the keys, his fingers relaxed, slightly curved. The entire ballroom held its breath, a collective intake of air in anticipation of a catastrophe. And then the first note came. It came not as a crash, but as a breath. A single crystalline F-sharp struck so gently it seemed to materialize from the silence rather than break it. It was clean, perfect, and deeply, achingly sad. It was followed by a G-sharp, then a C-sharp, the opening phrase of Chopin's posthumous nocturne in C-sharp minor. The melody unfurled into the room like a ribbon of dark silk. It was a sound so exquisitely controlled, so filled with a sorrowful beauty that it was a physical shock. The man who had bet 500 pounds on him, not knowing how to open the lid, froze his hand halfway to his wine glass. The woman who had joked about the white keys let her smile falter, then collapse entirely. Liam was not playing notes. He was weaving a spell. His left hand moved with an impossible fluid grace, laying down a soft foundation of arpeggios, as even and gentle as rainfall. His right hand gave the melody its voice, a voice that spoke of loss of memory, of a beauty that persists even in darkness. He played with a subtle, heartbreaking rubato, pushing and pulling the tempo, letting each phrase breathe as if it were a living thing. Sir Alistair Finch leaned forward, his professional detachment shattering. His trained ear missed nothing, the flawless legato. The pearlescent quality of the faster passages, the profound understanding of the harmony where a single note held in the bass could change the entire emotional color of the phrase. This was not the playing of a janitor. This was not even the playing of a competent professional. This was the work of an artist. The laughter that had filled the room didn't just vanish, it was extinguished. It was sucked out of the air, replaced by a thick, attentive silence. Phones were lowered. The quiet chit-chat ceased. People who had been slouching in their chairs sat up, unconsciously drawn in. They had come for a spectacle, for the thrill of a public failure. Instead, they were being given a confession. Eleanor's smile was frozen on her face, an old mask that no longer fit. The sounds coming from the piano were not in her script. They were supposed to be clumsy, jarring, a confirmation of her superiority. But this music was doing something else entirely. It was bypassing her anger, her pride, her carefully constructed defenses, and speaking to a place deep inside her she had long since abandoned. A phantom memory surfaced. She was 10 years old, sitting at an old upright in her family's country estate. Her tutor, a stern old woman, was rapping her knuckles. "No, Lady Eleanor. You are striking the keys. You must press them. Feel the weight. Silence is also a note." She had hated that lesson. Silence to her had meant absence, a lack of power. But the silence Liam poured between Chopin's phrases was different. It was full of meaning, heavy with unspoken things. From her place by the service door, Mrs. Davies watched her stern Welsh composure finally breaking. A single slow tear traced a path down her cheek. She wasn't crying for his humiliation, but for his vindication. She knew a fraction of his story, and this music was its beautiful, tragic testament. Liam's eyes were half closed, his body swaying slightly with the rhythm. He was no longer in the Beaumont's grand ballroom. He was in his father's study, the scent of old paper in his nostrils, the evening light fading outside the window. He was playing for an audience of one, a man whose memory was now locked away in the quiet corridors of a nursing home. Each phrase was a memory he was polishing and setting free. When the final delicate arpeggio climbed the keyboard and dissolved into a single quiet chord, he held it. He let the sound hang in the air, its resonance clinging to the crystal chandeliers and the velvet curtains. Then he lifted the pedal, and the sound died away completely. Silence. Not the awkward, tense silence of the wine stain, not the mocking silence of the wager. This was a new kind of silence, deep, warm, and profound. It was a silence filled with the ghost of the music, heavy with a respect so absolute it felt sacred. The room as one seemed to exhale. The power had shifted. The dare had been met. The joke was over. The final chord of the nocturne had vanished, but the silence it left behind was a tangible presence. It settled over the grand ballroom, heavier and more profound than any sound. It was a silence that judged. In it, the memory of the earlier laughter and cruel jokes seemed tawdry and shameful. For 5, 10, 15 seconds, no one moved, no one coughed, no one dared to clap. To applaud felt somehow inadequate, like offering polite praise after witnessing a soul being laid bare. They were no longer an audience of vultures, they were an assembly of stunned witnesses. Liam remained seated, his hands resting loosely in his lap. He did not turn to face the room, did not seek approval. His posture was one of quiet finality. He had said everything he needed to say with the music. The rest was up to them. The first sound came from the front row. It wasn't a clap, but a soft, sharp exhale. Sir Alistair Finch, the critic, slowly, deliberately lowered his chin by a single centimeter. It was not a bow. It was a professional's gesture of acknowledgement, a silent, unequivocal verdict. In the world of classical music, that small movement from Sir Alistair carried more weight than a standing ovation. A young journalist near him saw the gesture and frantically began typing notes into his phone. The story had just changed. It was that tiny motion that seemed to break the spell. A single person began to clap tentatively at first, then with more conviction. Another joined, then a dozen, then the entire room erupted, but the applause was different now. It was not the polite, rhythmic clapping of a society gala. It was a raw, explosive, almost desperate sound. It was the sound of recognition. It was the sound of apology. Several guests got to their feet, their eyes fixed on the man at the piano. The man who had bet £1,000 on him, failing to play a scale, now stood clapping with a look of stunned reverence on his face. Eleanor remained seated, frozen in place. The applause washed over her, but it felt like a wave of heat branding her with the scale of her miscalculation. The thin smile was gone, her face a blank mask of shock. The control she had wielded so effortlessly just minutes ago had evaporated. It hadn't been wrestled from her. She had handed it over, wagered it on a certainty that had just been demolished by an 88-key refutation. The dashboard of risks and calculations that usually ran in her mind, shareholder opinions, brand image, her uncle's approval, had gone offline. She was left with a single raw and deeply unsettling feeling: she had been wrong. Not just strategically wrong, but morally wrong. And she had been so in the most public way imaginable. She looked at Liam's back. He hadn't even looked at her. He had simply sat down and dismantled her world note by devastating note. He had not fought her on her terms with power, money, or status. He had fought on his own on a plane where she had no defense. Her uncle, Lord Ashworth, was also standing clapping along with the rest, his face a perfect mask of aristocratic poise. But his eyes, when they briefly met Eleanor's, were cold. She had created this spectacle, and now she had lost control of it. She had wagered the family name, and the janitor was against all odds winning. The PR manager, a woman trained to spin any disaster, leaned toward Eleanor and whispered urgently, "My lady, you must stand. Frame this. We can spin this as discovering hidden talent. A Beaumont miracle." But Eleanor couldn't move. Her legs felt as if they were made of lead. The word miracle sounded grotesque. This wasn't a miracle. It was a reckoning. She had tried to make a man small, and he had responded by showing her how small her own world was. Liam finally turned not to the audience, but to look at her. His expression was unreadable. There was no triumph in his eyes, no anger, no satisfaction. There was only a quiet, unnerving calm. The gaze of a man who knew exactly who he was, looking at a woman who was just beginning to realize she had no idea. It was this look more than the music or the applause that finally broke through her shock. She felt a flush of heat rise up her neck, a shame so acute it was almost painful. The crimson stain on her dress, which had moments ago been a symbol of her violated pride, now felt like a mark of her own guilt, a scarlet letter she had pinned on herself. The power had not just shifted, it had inverted. The entire room now looked to him, waiting to see what he would do next. And Eleanor Vance, for the first time in her impeccably managed life, had no idea what to say. The weight of the silence that followed the applause was now entirely hers to bear. As the wave of applause began to subside, leaving a charged silence in its wake, Liam turned his attention back to the piano. He did not stand. He did not bow. He simply acted as if the first piece had been a prelude, a mere clearing of the throat before the main address. This simple act of remaining seated sent a fresh ripple of anticipation through the room. He wasn't finished. He rolled his shoulders, once a gesture of settling in for serious work. Then his hands rose and descended upon the keys again. If the nocturne had been a watercolor painting, fluid, emotional, and shaded with sorrow, what came next was a master architect's blueprint rendered in steel. He launched into the clean crystalline opening of Bach's Prelude in C major from the well-tempered clavier. The change in tone was immediate and dramatic. Where Chopin had been about feeling, Bach was about structured discipline and a kind of divine mathematics. Each note was a perfect, distinct sphere of sound arranged in a flawless ascending pattern. His hands, which had been so expressive and fluid for Chopin, were now models of economic precision. There was no wasted motion, no theatrical flourish. It was pure, unadorned technique. The crowd, which had just been swept away on a tide of emotion, now found itself held captive by sheer technical brilliance. They were witnessing a level of control that was almost inhuman. The arpeggios flowed from his fingers not like music, but like a string of perfectly matched pearls, each one given its exact weight and value before making way for the next. He used the pedal with surgical sparsity, just enough to connect the harmony but never to cloud it, so that the intricate architecture of Bach's counterpoint was laid bare for all to hear. Sir Alistair Finch watched utterly transfixed. This was the true test. Chopin could be faked by a sentimental player with a good ear. Bach could not. Bach exposed every flaw, every weakness in a pianist's training, and Liam had no flaws. Sir Alistair's mind, a vast library of performances he had witnessed over 40 years, began to race. He noted the perfect evenness of the right-hand arpeggios, a feat notoriously difficult to maintain. He noted the subtle voicing in the left hand, how Liam brought out a hidden melodic line in the bass that most pianists ignored. He saw the complete relaxation of his shoulders and wrists, the source of his beautiful, unforced tone. This wasn't just talent, this was discipline. This was years of relentless, monotonous, soul-crushing practice. This was thousands of hours spent in a small room alone with a piano, building a cathedral of sound, one brick at a time. A memory, faint at first, then sharper, pricked at the edge of Sir Alistair's consciousness. A student showcase at the Royal Academy of Music perhaps a decade ago. A young, fiercely focused Nigerian British boy playing Liszt with a fire that had bordered on arrogance. A name he had jotted down in his notebook, a name he had followed for a year or two before it had simply vanished. On stage, Liam was building his case note by note. He was demonstrating that the nocturne had not been a fluke. He was proving with the irrefutable logic of Bach that he was the genuine article. He was not just an artist. He was a master craftsman, an architect of sound. Eleanor watched his hands. She had taken piano lessons for 12 years, prodded by a mother who believed it was an essential part of a young lady's education. She knew enough to understand the terrifying difficulty of what he was doing. She knew the concentration it required, the years of training it represented, and she had offered to buy his silence with the cost of cleaning a dress. The thought made her feel physically ill. The foundation of her world, built on the solid bedrock of class, pedigree, and wealth, was cracking beneath her feet. The neat categories she used to organize her universe, guest and staff, superior and subordinate, worthy and unworthy, were becoming meaningless. She had thrown down a gauntlet expecting to fight a peasant. She had not realized she was challenging a king. As Liam played the final resolute C major chord, letting it resonate with clean, triumphant finality, A second wave of applause erupted, even more thunderous than the first. It was no longer just an apology. It was a coronation. But before the sound could reach its peak, a woman's voice, frail but clear, rose from a table at the back of the room. "I know him," she said, her voice trembling with the shock of recognition. "That's him. That's Liam Adebayo." The name Liam Adebayo dropped into the grand ballroom like a stone into a still pond. The applause faltered as heads turned toward the source of the voice. An elderly woman draped in pearls and tweed was leaning forward, her hand pressed against her chest. Her face was pale with the shock of a memory made suddenly vividly real. "Adebayo," she repeated more firmly this time, as if tasting the name to confirm its authenticity. "He won the Young Classical Masters competition. It must have been, 10 years ago. I was a patron. I remember that Bach. No one forgets a Bach like that." A new kind of murmur swept through the room, a current of frantic energy. The narrative had shifted again from public shaming to astonishing talent, and now to a tantalizing mystery. Phones that had been lowered were raised again, but now they were instruments of research, not mockery. Fingers flew across screens, typing the name into search engines. Sir Alistair Finch felt a jolt of confirmation, as if a lost file had just been retrieved from the archives of his mind. Adebayo, of course, the boy from the academy. The one who played Liszt like he was wrestling with God. The one whose name had been on everyone's lips for 2 seasons before he had disappeared so completely it was as if he had never existed. "She's right," Sir Alistair said, his voice carrying the calm weight of authority. He didn't shout, but the room quieted to hear him. He stood up, addressing not the crowd, but the truth itself. Liam Adebayo. He was considered the most promising pianist of his generation at the Royal Academy, a prodigious talent. He looked directly at Liam, who had finally risen from the piano bench and stood motionless, his face a mask. At a table near the wall, Mrs. Davies, the head housekeeper, closed her eyes for a brief moment. She had guarded this secret for 5 years, respecting the quiet dignity with which Liam had sought his anonymity. She knew the parts of the story that the concert patrons and critics did not. A younger guest, a tech entrepreneur who lived by data, suddenly gasped, "It's him! I've got it!" He turned his phone around to show his tablemates. The screen glowed with an old article from the Guardian's culture section. The headline read, "A new star in the classical firmament, Liam Adebayo's fiery debut." Beneath it was a photograph of a much younger Liam, thin, intense, and serious, in a formal concert tuxedo, bowing before a grand piano. The phone was passed from hand to hand like a holy relic. The image spread through the room, virally phone to phone, a ghost from the past, materializing in the digital present. What happened? Someone whispered aloud the question on everyone's mind. The answer came not from the critic or the patrons, but from the quiet housekeeper who had seen him come to work every day, his shoulders a little heavier each year. Mrs. Davies took a hesitant step forward from the shadows. All her training told her to remain invisible, but her loyalty to the young man who had just reclaimed his soul was stronger. "His father happened," she said, her Welsh accent soft but clear, cutting through the whispers. The room fell silent again, turning to this new, unexpected source of information. "His father fell ill," Mrs. Davies continued, her voice gaining strength. "A degenerative illness. It was slow, and it was cruel, and it was expensive. Liam was an only child. His mother had passed years before. Everything fell to him." She looked over at Liam, her eyes asking for his permission to continue. He gave a single, almost imperceptible nod. "He tried to do both," she said. "He practiced at night and cared for his father during the day. He gave up concert tours to stay close to the hospital. But the bills were a storm that never ended. There are no scholarships for looking after a dying parent." A heavy, uncomfortable silence settled on the room. This was a truth far messier and more painful than a simple story of a forgotten prodigy. "He sold his piano first," Mrs. Davies said, her voice dropping to a whisper, the one he'd won in the competition. "He sold it to pay for a round of treatment that bought his father 6 more months. After that, he left the academy. He took any job he could find that had evening shifts so he could be at the nursing home during the day. He came here." She paused, and her gaze swept over the room from the diamond-draped guests to the uniformed staff who lingered at the edges listening. He locked his music away. Because every time he touched a piano, it didn't sound like Bach or Chopin anymore. It sounded like hospital monitors. It smelled like antiseptic, It felt like failure. The story hung in the air, stark and devastating. It explained everything. The skill, the silence, the sorrow in the heart of the music. Eleanor stood rooted to the spot, feeling as though the floor had given way beneath her. The man she had ridiculed, the man she had tried to turn into a caricature for her own amusement, had a history of sacrifice and quiet heroism she could barely comprehend. Her own problems, board meetings, shareholder discontent seemed like the petty grievances of a spoiled child in the face of his reality. She had mocked a man for his uniform without ever wondering about the battles that had forced him to wear it. Sir Alistair Finch cleared his throat. There was more to it, he added, his voice laced with a grim anger. I remember the talk now. The institutional barriers. He didn't fit the mold. His style was too passionate, not refined enough for some patrons. He was told his image needed work. These are the quiet ways a world like ours protects its own and pushes out those who are different. He looked directly at Lord Ashworth. We smother talent when it doesn't come in the package we expect. The mystery of Liam Adebayo was solved, and in its place was a collective gut-wrenching shame that settled on the gilded room as thick and suffocating as fog. Every person there was complicit in the system that had taken a genius and turned him into a janitor. And Eleanor Vance, with her careless, cruel wager, had just become the face of that system. The story of Liam Adebayo did not seep out of the grand ballroom. It detonated. In the age of instant connectivity, the 100 phones held aloft were not just recording devices, they were broadcast antennas. Before the collective shame in the room had even fully settled, the digital storm had broken. A young man near the back shouted, his voice cracking with excitement. It's on Twitter. It's trending. On screens across the room, the same story Bloom told in a flurry of fragmented clips and furious text. A viral video crudely edited but devastatingly effective, cut directly from Eleanor's imperious dare to the sublime opening bars of the nocturne. The contrast was damning. Hashtags swelled by the second Liam Adebayo Beaumont disgrace, keep your word, Vance. Eleanor felt the invisible shield of her family's prestige shatter into a million pixels. Her phone, which she had left on a side table, began to buzz, incessantly vibrating against the polished wood like a trapped, frantic insect. The hotel's PR manager rushed to her side, her face ashen. My lady, we have news vans arriving. The main switchboard is flooded. Legal is on the line, they say, to make no statement under any circumstances. But it was too late for no statement. Her statement had already been made, her face and words looped for the world to see. The public, now armed with the tragic backstory, was not just watching a spectacle, they were sitting on a jury. From the corner of her eye, she saw her uncle Lord Ashworth slipping discreetly out a side exit, abandoning the ship he had helped steer into the iceberg. The room, moments before a temple of high society, was now a chaotic vortex of ringing phones and flashing screens. The focus was no longer on Liam's talent, but on Eleanor's promise. A man's voice boomed from the crowd. You swore on the Vance name. What are you going to do about it? Keep your word, another shouted. Eleanor felt a wave of claustrophobia. The air was thick with expectation and judgment. She was cornered. Then through the noise, she heard Liam's voice, calm and clear. This is not a matter for a mob, he said, stepping forward. He was not looking at the crowd, but at her. Lady Eleanor and I need to speak, in private. A ripple of dissent went through the room. No, say it here. But Sir Alistair Finch rose again. He is right, the critic announced. Justice requires deliberation, not a shouting match. Give them the space to find it. His authority, now cemented, was enough to quell the loudest voices. Eleanor seized the opportunity like a drowning woman grasping a rope. The library, she managed to say to her frantic PR manager, 5 minutes. Security formed a tight corridor, parting the sea of guests. As Eleanor walked, she felt the burn of 100 phone cameras on her back. The short journey from the ballroom to the library felt like a walk of shame a mile long. The heavy oak door of the library swung shut behind them, and the noise of the world was instantly cut off. Silence returned, but this was a heavy, suffocating silence filled with the ghosts of everything that had just happened. The room smelled of old leather and lemon oil, a scent of tradition and order that now seemed like a mockery. Eleanor leaned against a vast mahogany desk, her thumb unconsciously rubbing the dried, dark stain on her dress. Liam stood in the center of the room, a measured distance away. He did not sit. He simply waited. What do you want? Eleanor finally asked, her voice a dry whisper. She reverted to the only language she truly understood. A check. Name a figure. We can sign a non-disclosure agreement. This can all be... She searched for the word, managed. Liam's expression did not change, but a look of profound disappointment flickered in his eyes. You still don't understand, he said softly. My dignity is not for sale. This isn't about me and it isn't about money. Then what is it about? She snapped a last vestige of her aristocratic anger flaring up. It is about the promise you made, Liam said, his voice calm and resolute. And it is about ensuring that what happened to me tonight never happens to anyone else in this hotel again. It is about the culture that allows a person to be turned into a punchline. He took a step closer. You asked what I want. Here it is, not a request for myself, a plan for the Beaumont. He laid out his terms, not with the anger of a victim, but with the clear-eyed precision of a strategist. One, he began a public apology. Not a press release written by your lawyers. You in your own words will apologize to me by name. You will acknowledge that your actions were dehumanizing, not just an unfortunate incident. Eleanor flinched. Two, he continued, you will establish the Adebayo Fund in my father's name. A fully endowed scholarship for underprivileged musicians at the Royal Academy with a preference for students from minority backgrounds. It will be managed by an independent board. Your family will fund it, but you will not control it. 3, you will launch the Keys for Dignity concert series. Free professional-grade concerts held quarterly in the community halls of London's less affluent boroughs, bringing music to people who cannot afford a ticket to a place like this. He paused, letting the weight of his words settle in the quiet room. And 4, the most important part, systemic change. You will immediately abolish any internal policies that encourage staff to be invisible. You will mandate bias and respect training for all management, starting with yourself and the board. And you will hold monthly open listening sessions with your frontline staff, the cleaners, the kitchen porters, the security guards, to hear their truths, anonymously and without repercussions. Eleanor stared at him speechless. He was not asking for compensation. He was demanding a revolution. He was asking her to dismantle the very system of hierarchy and exclusion that had given her her power. I take no money, Liam said, his voice quiet but unbending. I want no job. My only role will be to serve on the advisory board for the fund and to help you structure the first listening session. After that, my part is done. Her mind raced, calculating the cost, the logistics, the sheer impossibility of it all. This will be seen as an admission of guilt, she whispered. It will destroy the brand. The brand is already being destroyed, Liam countered calmly. Right now out there, your family's name is a synonym for arrogance and cruelty. This is your one chance to make it mean something else. You swore on the Vance name, my lady. I am offering you a way to redeem it. She looked at him. Truly looked at him for the first time, at the profound weariness in his eyes, but also at the unshakable core of integrity. He was offering her not a punishment, but a path, a difficult, expensive, and deeply humbling path. Why, she asked the question, genuine. After what I did, why offer me a way out? Liam was silent for a moment. Because I know what it feels like to have your world collapse, he said. And because my father taught me that true strength isn't about never falling. It's about how you choose to get back up. The whole world is watching you, Lady Eleanor. What will you choose? The reckoning was complete. The choice was now hers. The oak door of the library swung open, and the muted roar of the ballroom rushed back in. But this time Eleanor did not flinch from it. She stepped out, not with the defensive posture of the accused, but with the quiet resolve of someone who had made a decision. Liam followed a half-step behind her, a silent partner in the act to come. The crowd parted before them. All eyes were on Eleanor as she walked directly to the low stage. She didn't look at the PR manager frantically waving a printed statement. She bypassed the microphone on the lectern, picking up a handheld one instead. It was a small gesture, but a significant one. She was not hiding behind a podium. She stood at the center of the stage, the crimson stain on her dress no longer a mark of shame, but a testament to the moment that had changed everything. She looked out at the sea of faces, guests, staff, journalists, and waited for the room to fall completely silent. Tonight she began, her voice steady and clear, devoid of the cold, aristocratic edge it had held before I did something unforgivable. There was no preamble, no corporate hedging, just the plain, unvarnished truth. A collective breath was held. I used my position and my privilege to humiliate a man. I failed to see him as a person, and instead I used him as a prop in a display of my own arrogance. His name is Liam Adebayo, and he deserved my respect. Instead, I gave him my contempt. She turned her head and looked directly at Liam. Mr. Adebayo, I'm sorry. Not because I was caught, not because this has become a crisis. I'm sorry because what I did was wrong. She then turned back to the room. I made a promise tonight. I swore on my family's name, a name that at this moment is rightfully being associated with disgrace. A promise made in cruelty is not a promise that should be kept in its original form, but a promise of honor must be redeemed with honorable action. She took a deep breath. Therefore, I am not here to offer a simple gesture. I am here to announce a new direction for the Beaumont, a new legacy. With the crisp precision of a CEO announcing a quarterly report, but with the solemnity of a person making a vow, she laid out the plan. Effective immediately, we are establishing the Adebayo Fund in honor of Mr. Adebayo's late father to provide full scholarships for gifted musicians from underserved communities at the Royal Academy. An independent board will be announced by the end of the week. A murmur of genuine surprise went through the room. This was not a token donation. This was a substantial structural commitment. Furthermore, we will launch the Keys for Dignity concert series. These will be free concerts bringing the best of classical music to community venues across London with Mr. Adebayo's guidance. The first concert will be held next month. And finally, she set her gaze sweeping over the staff who stood clustered by the walls. We will begin the real work internally. My entire management team and I will undergo mandatory intensive bias and respect training. All internal policies that depersonalize our staff will be abolished, and my door will be open. We will listen. She lowered the microphone for a moment, then raised it again. This is not charity. This is a debt. It is the first payment on a debt owed to every person who has ever been made to feel invisible within these walls. She set the microphone down. The silence that followed was profound. And then Sir Alistair Finch began to clap. It was a slow, deliberate, rhythmic clap. One by one, others joined in, not with the explosive applause from before, but with a steady rolling ovation of respect. It was an acknowledgement not of a performance, but of character. As the applause swelled, Liam stepped forward. He did not speak. He simply walked to the piano and sat down. He waited for the room to quiet, for all attention to settle back on the music. This was his part of the agreement. She had used her words. He would now use his. This time he played something no one in the room had ever heard before, because it had not existed until this moment. It was his own composition. He began with a simple questioning melody in the right hand, a motif that seemed to hesitate to search. It was then answered by a deep, resonant chord in the left hand, a sound of grounding of foundation. It was the music of a question being answered. The piece was a fusion, a conversation between two worlds. In it, you could hear the complex classical structures of his training, the echoes of Bach and Chopin. But woven through it, unmistakable and proud, were the rhythms and melodic cadences of Yoruba folk music from his Nigerian heritage. It was a sound that was wholly his. It was the music of a man putting the broken pieces of his identity back together. It was not a lament for what was lost, but a celebration of what had endured. He played with a joy that had been absent before, a warmth that spread through the room like sunlight. The piece built layer upon layer into a complex, beautiful tapestry of sound, a cadenza, a brilliant, unaccompanied passage where the soloist can finally speak in their own true voice. He was playing the story of his life, the pain, the sacrifice, the injustice, but also the love, the resilience, the enduring power of his culture and his art. Eleanor stood on the stage listening, and for the first time she did not feel judged by the music. She felt invited in. She saw the path forward not as a punishment, but as an opportunity, a chance to build something better on the ruins of her own arrogance. As the final triumphant chord of the Beaumont cadenza rang out and faded into a respectful, reverent silence, Liam Adebayo finally looked at the audience, at the whole room, and gave a small, dignified bow. The work was not over, but it had begun. The applause that followed the final note of the cadenza was long and heartfelt, but it had a different quality. The night was no longer about a duel between a janitor and a lady. It had become a shared moment of transition. As the sound faded, the real work began quietly and without fanfare. Eleanor did not remain on the stage to soak in the approval. She stepped down, her first action to walk not to a reporter or an influential guest, but to Mrs. Davies, who still stood by the service entrance. Mrs. Davies, Eleanor said, her voice low enough that only the housekeeper could hear. The first listening session is tomorrow morning at 9, in the staff break room. I would be grateful if you would help me ensure everyone knows they are welcome and that their voices are wanted. The housekeeper, a woman who had spent 30 years navigating the hotel's rigid hierarchies, looked at her boss. For the first time, she saw not Lady Eleanor Vance, the inheritor of a dynasty, but just Eleanor. She gave a firm, respectful nod. "Of course, my lady, I will see to it." Across the room, Liam was approached by Sir Alistair Finch. The critic did not offer gushing praise. Instead, he extended a hand. "Mr. Adebayo," he said, his handshake firm, "I am the chairman of the Acquisitions Committee for the British Library's Sound Archive. We would be honored to have the score for that last piece. The Beaumont cadenza deserves to be preserved. It was the highest form of professional respect he could offer, an acknowledgement that Liam's work was not just a performance, but a piece of history." "I would be honored," Sir Alistair, Liam replied, a faint, genuine smile finally touching his lips. The guests began to depart, their conversations now hushed and thoughtful. The story they would tell of the evening had changed entirely. They had arrived for a party and had left having witnessed a profound act of moral correction. The man who had once shouted the bet about the piano lid quietly approached a uniformed waiter collecting glasses. He pressed 2 50-pound notes into the young man's hand. For the staff fund, he mumbled, his eyes averted in embarrassment, before quickly walking away. It was a small gesture, but it was a start. Eleanor saw her uncle Lord Ashworth waiting for her by the main exit. His expression was unreadable. "That was a costly performance, Eleanor," he said, his voice dry. "Yes, it was," she replied, her gaze steady. "It was an investment in an asset I have been neglecting for far too long, our integrity." She did not wait for his response. She turned and walked toward the staff exit, the one Liam had used all night. The security chief, Harris, moved to intercept her. "My lady, your car is at the front. I'm not leaving yet, Harris," she said. She gestured toward the service corridor. "I believe there is a staff bulletin board down that hallway. I'd like to see the notice about the policy changes go up myself." "Tonight." Harris stared at her for a moment, then stepped aside, a look of dawning respect on his face. Liam remained by the piano long after the ballroom had emptied, now a vast, silent space. The cleaning crews, his colleagues, had begun their work, their movements quiet and efficient. But tonight something was different. They walked with their shoulders a little straighter. They met each other's eyes. They called each other by name. He ran a hand gently over the polished ebony lid of the Bosendorfer, a gesture of farewell. His life had been irrevocably changed tonight, but he knew the path ahead was not one of concert halls and celebrity. His work now was of a different kind. He heard soft footsteps and turned to see Eleanor standing there. The room was empty save for the two of them and the distant rhythmic hum of a floor polisher. "The first meeting for the Adebayo Fund is on Friday," she said. It was not a question. It was a statement of fact. "I trust you will be there." "I will," Liam confirmed. She hesitated for a moment. "Thank you, Liam," she said quietly. "You gave me a gift tonight. You showed me that my family's name, our legacy, isn't just something to be protected. It's something that must be earned, every day. You are the one who chose to earn it, Eleanor," he replied. "That was your cadenza." She offered him a small, tired smile. Then she turned and walked away, her steps echoing in the vast, empty ballroom. Liam stayed a moment longer. He looked around the room at the chandeliers that had witnessed his humiliation and his vindication. He had entered this room as a ghost, a shadow meant to be overlooked. He would leave it as a man who had rediscovered his own name, and in doing so, had helped a powerful institution rediscover its soul. He walked out through the main doors under the grand archway and into the cool London night. The air felt clean and new. He did not know what the future held, but for the first time in a very long time, he felt the unmistakable quiet hum of a new composition beginning to form in a different, more hopeful key.